Oh Lord, you're beautiful. Your face is all
Hey everybody,
I
happy
see.
Wednesday. I hope you're doing good. Welcome to the midweek refuel where we're going to top off your tank in your spiritual life. Hopefully, you are doing well, and this will just add to your doing wellness or whatever the right word is. So, tonight we are covering Matthew chapter 21, and we're going to be looking at verses 18 through 27. And I actually really love this portion of scripture. Actually, probably might have bitten off more than I could chew because there's just so much good stuff in here. But hopefully, I will hit the highlights and you guys will be encouraged. So let's go there. Verse 18, Matthew 21. Now in the morning, when he was returning to the city, he became hungry. Seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it except leaves only. And he said to it, "No longer shall there ever be any fruit from you." And at once the fig tree withered. Seeing this, the disciples were amazed and asked, "How did the fig tree wither all at once?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and cast into the sea,' it will happen. And all things you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive." When he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him while he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority?" Jesus said to them, "I will also ask you one thing, which if you tell me, I will also tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John was from what source? From heaven or from men?" And they began reasoning among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Then why do you not believe him?' But if we say from men, we fear the people, for they all regard John as a prophet." And answering Jesus, they said, "We do not know." He also said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Okay, so obviously, really good stuff there. Lots that we can pull from. But let's start with the fig tree. Interesting story. Jesus becomes hungry, right? We see his humanity. And he goes to a fig tree. And there's some obvious symbolism there, right? Like it's a tree that has the promise of fruit. Looks like a good tree that would produce fruit. And I actually, I was going to say, I see this in my yard, but the apple trees that I have that are not producing this year don't look that great. So, but we have a few that are producing a lot of apples. And if I had gone to the apple tree with the hope of grabbing an apple and nothing was there, it would be very disappointing. And I think there is, as I was saying, obvious symbolism of that we should not only look good on the outside, but produce the fruit that is connected to our identity, right? And so he goes to the tree, wants to get fruit, doesn't have any fruit, and his response is a little interesting. He actually curses the fig tree, and the fig tree withers right there and then. Okay, might feel sorry for the fig tree a little bit, but it wasn't doing its job, I guess. I don't know. But I've actually heard some teaching on this particular story, and I really liked this particular slant on it. And that is that as a kingdom person, I am called to bear impossible fruit, right? And actually, what we don't see in this story that we see in the other gospels is that the other gospels tell us that it wasn't the season for figs. And so that makes this story even more challenging. But I like the interpretation that as a believer, now that the kingdom lives within me, that I don't have to just produce fruit when it's the season for it. I can produce fruit at all times. And that's really what he's calling us to do. And we see that from the second part of this particular portion of scripture, right? Because he goes into talking about if you have faith and don't doubt, what happened to the fig tree, what you can apply to other areas. And if you say to this mountain, "Be removed and cast into the sea," then it will happen, and whatever you ask in my name with faith, believing you'll receive. So let's break that down a little bit, right? So what we immediately go to is we look at things from a natural perspective, right? We're like, okay, so God says ask, I'm going to ask, and it says in the scripture that I'm going to receive what I ask for. But I see a lot of disillusioned believers because they ask for things they don't get. Okay, and then we have all kinds of theories on that. But what I really want to focus on is his purpose here is to teach faith, and faith is anchored in the unseen realm. Okay, faith is having heaven's perspective, right? So we know from Ephesians chapter 2 that we are, I had to think about that for a second, we are all seated with him in heavenly places. So we now have the interesting reality of, I live on the earth, but I see or have the potential to see from heaven's perspective. And that's what faith looks like. So when he's talking about asking and receiving, when he's talking about, say to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea, he's talking about having heaven's perspective and praying from that vantage point, right? So let's look at the mountain story. And if you've been around me, you know this little piece of revelation the Lord gave me a long time ago. But when he says that if we had the faith of a mustard seed, we could say to this mountain, be removed and cast into the sea. Just another version of what we're talking about. What I see happening here is that mustard seed is the smallest of any seed. If you've ever seen a mustard seed, it's very, very tiny. And if you have it in your fingers, no one would know because it's very small. But it grows into this tree, right? And he is saying to us that if we had the smallest amount of faith, we could move a mountain, right? And what I see is that when I have the smallest amount of faith, I have heaven's perspective over the situation that is in front of me. And so instead of the mountain being in my way, I see from the vantage point of being above the mountain because I'm seated with him in heavenly places. So if you were in an airplane and you're flying over a city, the buildings don't seem as big as if you were on the ground because you are looking at it from a 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 foot vantage point. You're looking at it from above. And that's really what Jesus is calling his disciples to here, is see things from a different vantage point. Okay? What seems impossible, a fig tree bearing figs in a season that isn't the season for figs, seems impossible. But when I have heaven's perspective, I realize that the impossible becomes possible because I'm connected to the source. And that's really what he's going after. And he's also challenging them on seeing things only from the natural. My father-in-law says that whatever we misdiagnose, we mistreat, right? So oftentimes we misdiagnose what God is doing because we have a perspective of what he's going to do. And when he doesn't do what we have expectation for, we think there's a failure on his end instead of realizing that we need to shift our perspective and see things differently. And so when we do that, oftentimes we misdiagnose a situation and we mistreat either the individual or ourselves. And that is just not a good place to go. We have to see from heaven's perspective. And then I chose this last part because I think it also ties into this theme where the Pharisees come to him and they're always trying to trick him. And they ask him, they ask him, by what authority, let me go back to make sure that I have the right, by what authority are you doing these things? And so Jesus asks them a question. He says, well, was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? Okay, so he sort of changes the narrative a little bit, but it's got the same theme. So he's saying, did John create a crowd based on his own ability, or was it from God, right? So now they have a dilemma, and the scripture brings us into their dilemma, right? And the dilemma is that if they criticize John, that the people will not be happy with them because they regarded John as a prophet, right? And if they say from heaven, then people are going to question whether or not. Sorry, I had to look at the story. People are going to question, why don't you believe Jesus if you say that what he is teaching is from heaven? And so they're in a dilemma. They don't want to answer Jesus' question, and so Jesus says, "I'm not going to tell you by which authority I'm doing these things." Right? And so, really, what he's pointing out is the very thing that we're talking about: is they weren't seeing from heaven's perspective; they were seeing from the perspective of the natural, and so because of that, he wasn't going to tell them by what authority that he was teaching, because they wouldn't have seen it anyway. They were just looking at things from, what does this mean for us as the Pharisees? What does this mean for the institution of, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, the Sadducees? What does it mean for us? Because this guy is coming on the scene and he's challenging what is being taught. He's challenging the perspective of people. And, if they change the way that they think, then it affects us and it affects our livelihood. And that was the vantage point that they were looking at. And so the dangers of reasoning is that it keeps us locked into a natural perspective that is I was going to say the antidote. In some ways, it is the antidote to faith. We don't want an antidote to faith. And so when we get caught up in our reasoning, it's very hard to see from heaven's perspective. Remember, Jesus through Paul said that what is wise to men is foolishness to God, right? And what is wisdom to God is foolishness to men. And so, we can get caught up in our own reasoning, thinking we know better, when really our job is to have heaven's perspective. In fact, Hebrews tells us that without faith, it's impossible to please God. So we have to have heaven's perspective to operate in a way that he has designed us to operate in, and to change the environment around us. This should motivate us, because when we know what heaven's doing, we know how to pray, and we know how to bring heaven to earth. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, because our perspective has shifted. And not only does it change things around us, but more importantly, it begins to change things in us, right? Especially now, this is really important, and God has been challenging me on this throughout the last couple of years, but specifically lately, is what am I feeding myself with? What am I seeing? Because what I see is what I'll reproduce. And so I just want to challenge us as we finish out this week. Let's change our perspective. Let's look from heaven's perspective and see what heaven is doing, and cooperate with what heaven is doing. And we're going to see the impossible, and we're going to bear fruit that we never thought would ever happen, because God is in us. So hope you're encouraged. I hope you have a great week, and we will talk to you next time.
Oh Lord, you're beautiful. Your face is all